within the Institute of New Economic Thinking based in New York. He is further a Commonwealth and an Organization of American States scholar. Richard holds a Master of Arts in Economics from the University of Hyderabad, India, along with several certificates from the IMF, World Bank, and UN, in topics such as macroeconomic stability, financial programming, debt sustainability, development effectiveness, evaluation, and sustainable growth. He's also the former president of the University of Guyana Student Society and sits on several national technical committees as well as bilateral trade and investment councils. He is focused on civic improvement and practice of a wealth of knowledge, transcending several fields that include economics, development finance, political science, history, sociology, trade, private sector development, management, and social psychology. Welcome, Rich.
Thanks so much.
You have a very impressive resume. I'm looking forward to putting some of your practice skills to work this evening.
Yeah, no problem.
Let me begin asking, what does a Chamber of Commerce do? Seeing that you're the executive director of Guyana's Chamber of Commerce and Industry, what does the Chamber do?
So, thank you so much for asking that question. You know, every time I go on programs discussing the Chamber of Commerce, it's always that question to kick it off. And I think it's an important one because the Chamber of Commerce is a misunderstood organization here in Guyana. It's a private sector umbrella organization. However, it's a unique private sector umbrella organization in that it is one which is legislatively mandated. So the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce is actually established by an Act of Parliament, which is 1889. However, the Act was revised in 1982 to expand the purview and the mandate of the Chamber of Commerce. Essentially, it's a business support organization, and the Chamber of Commerce is an independently organized organization. It has members of the private sector, and what we do is that we advocate, lobby on behalf of the private sector. We also offer networking services. We're involved in several trade missions, international relations, improving the private sector. So the actual focus of the Chamber of Commerce, in a general sense, I would say, is to ensure that there is private sector growth and development in Guyana.
Oh, I see, I see. Now, seeing that it's such a unique organization, how is it funded? Who funds the Chamber of Commerce?
So the Chamber of Commerce, in its structure, it's the oldest and the largest private sector umbrella organization here in Guyana. It's also the only one which is legislatively mandated. Currently, we have almost 250 private sector entities who are subscribed to the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and they are categorized based on their size. So you have different tiers of membership. You have about 4 tiers of membership, all from large companies all the way down to small companies, to micro companies. Now, that is what makes the Chamber of Commerce a very unique organization also, because the Chamber of Commerce is one where you have a number of businesses spanning all sectors as well as all sizes. So it's one where it's funded, of course, by its members and subscription fees and fundraisers and such like. But fundamentally, going back to the previous question, if you look at the nature of the businesses which are associated with the Chamber of Commerce, like I said, it's a very unique organization because it's not a strict sectoral body, as to say it focuses only on tourism, it focuses only on forestry. It spans a range of sectors as well as sizes. So when the Chamber of Commerce makes a pronouncement on an issue, it's a pronouncement on an issue which comes from a multidimensional approach. You have an approach where you're taking into consideration not just a specific sector, but one which is spanning all sectors as well as all sizes.
I see, I see. Now, I am assuming that there are quite a few companies, large and small, that are members.
Yes.
And there's also a lot of companies that are not members.
Yes.
If I were the owner of a company and I wanted my company to become a member, how do I go about doing that?
So, great question, Andy. It's a very simple process. We don't ask for too much at the Chamber of Commerce, but we still need to do certain checks to ensure and verify the reputation and the quality of the company. So we'd ask for a couple of basic things: your business registration, your TIN, your taxpayer's identification number, your NIS, either your registration or your compliance, preferably your NIS compliance to show that you're contributing to NIS, and an organizational profile for our records. With that, it'll also require you to have a recommendation from a member of the Chamber of Commerce who's currently there. However, if that is not the case, we will ensure from the GCCI's Secretariat that we do apt research on the company to ensure that the company is a trustworthy organization and one which is worthy of chamber membership. Because I think this might lead into something which you'll ask a little bit later on benefits of being members of the chamber, of being a member of the Chamber of Commerce.
Okay. Now, is membership open to companies outside of Guyana or only within Guyana?
Yes. So the Chamber of Commerce has a category of membership which is called non-resident members. So we have a number of members currently in our membership who are overseas members. I'm just going to name a few. For example, KPMG, the tax and auditing firm in Trinidad and Tobago, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the very famous accounting firm. So those are just a couple of our members which we have. We also have Arthur Lock Jack Global School of Business, who are members of the Chamber of Commerce. So there is that category, and the fee for it is just about $500 per year. For someone to benefit from the information hub which the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry is, $500 per year is a negligible investment for a business who is serious about entering into Guyana.
No, but that's the fee for an international company.
Yes, a non-resident member.
What is the fee for a local company?
So it varies based on your tier. So the very small businesses, the micro businesses, who have a turnover of less than about $5 million per year, they pay around $12,000, and then it begins to go up. So that's the fourth tier. By the time you reach the third tier, you're talking around $25,000 per year. The second tier is around $50,000, and then the largest companies pay $100,000 per year.
So the largest company are in the same level as a foreign company.
Yes.
Investing and trying to get into.
In that regard, yes. In terms of their fee and the amount that they pay.
I see. This is going to be a kind of a tricky question.
Mm-hmm.
But how free of political influence is GCCI?
Mm-hmm. So, like I mentioned earlier, the Chamber of Commerce is an independently organized body. Its membership comprises private sector organizations, and it's completely free from political interference. We ask for no donations to fund our operations by government, though from time to time we partner with government agencies, key strategic partners, based on the nature of an event. So for example, a workshop, etc., we may ask the relevant agency or government ministry to partner with us. But as far as political interference goes, there is absolutely no political interference in the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry. It's an independently organized body, legislatively mandated to execute the task of private sector development here in Guyana.
Okay, well that's great. You mentioned the public sector more than once.
Yes.
What is your relationship with the PSC?
Okay, so the Private Sector Commission is a body which was founded in 1991, 92, thereabouts. The Private Sector Commission, if you'd like to put it this way, it's a chamber of chambers. As you know, there are many different sectoral private sector organizations. So you have Tourism and Hospitality Association of Guyana, Forest Producers Association, you have regional chambers of commerce, a number of other sectoral bodies. So the Private Sector Commission is an organization where all of the heads of these sectoral bodies meet, as well as a couple of corporate members of the Private Sector Commission, independent companies who are subscribed to the Private Sector Commission. I think it's about 25 of them. And then you have around 30 sectoral bodies. The Chamber of Commerce's relation with the Private Sector Commission is that the Chamber of Commerce, the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, is a sectoral member of the Private Sector Commission. So we are a member of the Private Sector Commission based on the fact that we are a sectoral body. The same way that, for example, another organization, another private sector umbrella organization would be a member. So the Private Sector Commission has two categories of membership: corporate members and sectoral members. The Chamber of Commerce and other private sector umbrella organizations fall under the construct of sectoral members.
I see, I see. There's been talk recently about, mostly about in the oil and gas industry,
Yes.
about Guyanese companies getting into the industry now and being able to enter on local, on par with the foreign companies coming in,
Yes.
almost. And it's been referred to as local content. I know you've spoken about this recently. Do you, from your perspective,
Yes.
is enough being done in terms of local content as it relates to a local company? Or do you think more should be done? Or what's your general feeling about local content?
That's a great question, Andy. So I think what we need to do first, before we go into how, or before we examine what is being done, I think we need to take stock of where we are. Guyana discovered oil in 2015, of course, and we're going to produce first oil in 2020. Now, Guyana is the fastest country in the world from discovery of oil to the production of oil. Just about 5 years. This process on average takes 8 to 10 years. Now that's a very unique thing for Guyana, because we traditionally have what is known as institutional inertia, a resistance to change and a resistance to transformation in varying sectors of our economy or the society. So in that regard, it's a challenge for Guyana. That institutional inertia does not only apply to the the public sector, but it also applies to different dimensions of the Guyanese structure. Now, local content is one way that we can actually accelerate the learning curve here in Guyana. Now, what do I mean by that? As you know, Guyana has not been an oil-producing country. Guyana has now discovered oil, and as such, many of our local companies don't have the years of experience and the years of expertise in this sector and doing sectoral specific or periphery services to the sector in the oil and gas. So what we have been promoting in the Chamber of Commerce is strategic partnerships, joint venture approach. So partnerships in general with companies who are more experienced. The Chamber of Commerce in this regard has embarked on a series of externalization efforts by signing MOUs with different private sector umbrella organizations in countries such as Canada, provinces such as Newfoundland and Labrador, where they traditionally have oil and gas expertise. Now, what we have been promoting is that companies come on board and partner with Guyanese firms so that you can help to accelerate the pace at which a company learns to do these things. So the services associated with the oil and gas sector. Now, coming back to local content specifically, as you asked, currently we're at the second draft of a policy in Guyana. As you know, the Chamber of Commerce is of a firm position that legislation needs to be enacted in Guyana. I've heard it being said in different quarters that policy and the finalization of policy must precede the enactment of legislation. Now, that is a very theoretical or a textbook approach to public policy and public policy approaches and governance of a macroeconomy. I think that we are not at this point in time doing enough. We are just about 2 years out from first oil, and we are still at a draft stage of our local content policy. Now, if the government of Guyana would like to first of all institute a policy and then move to legislation, that's fine. But let's work at least right now to finalizing this policy. I've heard that we are moving now to a third draft of the local content policy, and we are getting closer to first oil. My position, and the position which we take in the Chamber of Commerce, is that what we need in Guyana is a simple legislation. A legislation which says that first consideration, that's an important terminology to note. not first preference, which is a stronger axiom than consideration. First consideration should be given to Guyanese companies. The logic of the legislation then follows that if consideration is given to Guyanese companies, or first consideration should be given, what then is a Guyanese company? A Guyanese company, as we have defined it, our litmus test for a Guyanese company is one which is 51% owned by Guyanese and Guyanese citizens. The board meetings are kept here in Guyana, and a couple of other caveats. For example, around 60 to 70% of your employees should be Guyanese. I mean, those things are subject to change, but the structure is there that you should be employing Guyanese, and it's along that line. So generally, when one looks at the company, the face of it must still be Guyanese. I mean, so in spirit as well as in substance, the company, we still would like the company to be Guyanese. Where do we go from there? That is on the on the employer section. If the company, however, is not selected for a contract, in our model legislation, we say that the onus is on the contractor or the subcontractor to say why. Very simple, and that covers it for employers. In terms of employees, local content, we have a couple of things in there about skill transfer, technology transfer, and training. And then there's a caveat to the legislation, a part 3 of it, very short, on monitoring and accountability of whether local content is actually being followed. So it is not a structure like one would see in Nigeria or Brazil, where you have an extreme form of local content legislation that bars a contractor to a specific number of persons. So you have some local content legislation, like I mentioned, in Brazil, in Nigeria, and in some other African countries specifically, where they say 70% of this specific task must go to locals, must do this, you must do that. We're not saying that. The local content legislation which we would like to see here in Guyana is one which is termed in the literature of local content and oil and gas development, sectoral development, private sector development, as market-oriented. Because what we're trying to do with that is ensure that you have a sector of local companies in the oil and gas who can actually reach to an international standard. So it's not just that these companies have been given preferential treatment or they are being given preferential treatment. These companies, we're simply asking for first consideration to Guyanese companies. And that is a very important thing. Because as you know, the oil and gas sector is a very relational type of sector. And if our companies miss the boat now, it'll be very difficult for them to catch up in the future.
Correct, correct. Now, one of the challenges is that there are several companies currently in Guyana operating, and I don't think that they had to subscribe to those expectations that as you're defining them that meets the local content requirement. Is there a plan to have them meet that retroactively? How does that work? If you're here and you're not ascribing to our local content policies, do we make you or do we force you to become in compliance sometime in the future?
I wouldn't want to go along the route of saying things should be applied retroactively, and this is my personal perspective, because that has not been discussed in the Chamber of Commerce, and specifically the committee which deals with this is the Petroleum Subcommittee. So we have not discussed that extensively, but my personal opinion on it is that it should not be applied retroactively. What we should ensure is that from the time that we implement the legislation, that first consideration is given. You see, the thing is, local content, we should not be using it, or local content should not be viewed as a punitive measure. it should not be viewed as something which is adverse to the development of the companies or the operation of the oil and gas sector. Local content should be viewed as something which is beneficial for both parties, the operator and their subcontractors, as well as the Guyanese private sector. Why is that so? Let me give a simple example. If you have a Guyanese company who can provide local labor, can provide local goods manufactured right here, as opposed to a company who has to produce abroad, import the labor, you have to import the products and so on. We are working here locally from a cost competitive advantage. One of the things is that the oil sector never stops. The oil sector continues to go. What we don't have, what we have as an advantage over the companies or over the persons who are living abroad who seek to have the persons involved in the oil and gas sector is that we have a consistent supply of labor here. So it's not something which is adverse to the development of the oil sector. It's not something which should be viewed as adverse to the scheduling of the contractor, to the production of the contractor, and such like. It's something which should actually be viewed as a win-win for both sides, because the contractor benefits from a consistent pool of labor, which is going to have lower wages than persons who are living abroad and so on. And you also have the benefit to the local private sector, that they are involved in the oil and gas industry. They're gaining sectoral expertise with the view to eventually becoming an internationally competitive oil and gas sector firm.
Okay. Now, the reason why I asked that question is because there are several companies, and daily you've got companies registering in Guyana, coming on board in Guyana.
Yes, certainly.
At what point does Guyanese companies get on board? Because local content matters at the beginning, according to what you're saying.
Yes.
It doesn't matter in the future. So
No, it don't.
if we are not allowing Guyanese company to partner or to become part of this development now, first oil is about 2 years away, we've missed the bus. How do we fix that?
I can tell you, Andy, that's a very great question, and a very one which can, if we explore along the line, lend great insight. Don't think that things are not happening. Things are happening as we speak. Trade missions are being fielded to Guyana, and there are dozens upon dozens of companies who are partnering with foreign firms very successfully. Many of them local Guyanese businesses who are now in the nascent form and so on, partnering with foreign companies, and they're actually winning contracts, bidding, and getting a piece of the pie. Is this enough, or is the rate at which this is happening enough? No, but it is happening at the moment. If we go back to what you were saying, we should always strive to ensure that what we're doing here in Guyana is of a national view, nation-building view. And I think that if we move in the direction of that, we can ensure that the oil and gas sector and the benefits which accrue to the Guyanese, to the Guyana as a whole, assimilates to the entire population.
I see. You recently made a presentation on Guyana developing a sovereign wealth fund, and you seem to have the clearest indication of what it is and how it's supposed to work. Can you educate us on that fund?
All right, no problem. I won't want to take any glory to say that I have the clearest knowledge of it, but I have been reviewing the Sovereign Wealth Fund, or the Natural Resource Fund, the NRF Green Paper. It's a paper which was laid in Parliament August 7, 2018. It was laid August 7, 2018, and it seeks to establish not just a sovereign wealth fund, but a natural resource fund. So sovereign wealth funds are nothing more than a macroeconomic tool, right? It's a macroeconomic tool for stability of an economy. Our sovereign wealth fund, the intention of it is that there is going to be revenue accruing to the country from the oil and gas sector. Some of that revenue is going to be saved and some of it is going to be spent. The sovereign wealth fund is the construct or the rubric that provides the framework for how that money is going to be saved and how that money is going to be spent. What the sovereign wealth fund in our case does also is not just take money from the oil and gas sector, but it also takes money from mining as well as forestry. That in itself is something which needs discussion. But in this case, let me deal with the oil and gas sector only. The oil and gas sector, the oil prices, as you know, is very volatile. Follows an international price trend where trading is done on a spot market basis, and as such, the price is not fixed or well defined over intertemporal time period, as we call it. Fluctuates, and as such, if you are selling oil on the international market where that price fluctuates, your revenue that you garner is going to likewise fluctuate in a naturally accompanying way. So the intention of a sovereign wealth fund is to ensure that those commodity price cycles where the price rises and the price falls does not affect the government of a country too much. How does it do that? It does it through a thumb rule or mechanism called the fiscal rule. The fiscal rule talks about the accruing of revenue to the country. All of the revenue is going to be in the sovereign wealth fund, whichever account. I see in our structure it's in the consolidated, it's in a separate fund from the consolidated fund. Those are things which we have to look at in terms of our legislative and institutional framework that's existing, if we can accommodate that based on our constitution, the FMA, Fiscal Management and Accountability Act, and so on. But what happens is money comes in, put into the account, and then a certain amount will then be extracted by the government for spending. The sovereign wealth fund in that way buffers the government from having to deal with massive fluctuations in the price. How is that so? When the money goes into the fund, an economic commission, which is established, it's spoken about in the sovereign wealth fund paper, the green paper, an economic commission, as well as some mathematical calculations, will determine how much money can actually be extracted from the fund into the government's coffers. Now this is important because it is not something which will only be hinged on international markets or only be hinged on the local market or a specific index such as an inflation rate or so on. The macroeconomic committee is to look at a multidimensional or a number of factors in the economy, including inflation, interest rates, and a gamut of things. And that is going to be one factor out of three, which is going to determine what the extraction of the money from the sovereign wealth fund is going to be, to go to government as government's share. Now, this is in a conceptual form. Is it a simple thing in our conceptual form? No, it is not. And this is one of the things which we have been talking about at our energy forum, the inaugural energy forum last week Friday. That's one of the things which was mentioned. In philosophy of science and logic, there's something called Occam's razor, the principle of Occam's razor, where we say the simplest solution is oftentimes the best solution. Now, if you're going to have a sovereign wealth fund where its benefit is actually supposed to be for the people, you have to have a construct where the people can understand. If you look at the most successful countries in the world and the most successful countries who have sovereign wealth funds, I'll take Norway, for example. One of the things that causes Norway to be so successful is that you can ask the most technical academic, economists, social scientists, big data scientists, etc., what the sovereign wealth fund's fiscal rule is, or you can ask the man in the street, you can ask the taxi driver, you can ask the chef, you can ask the waiter, the waitress in Norway what the fiscal rule is. They'll be able to tell you. Why is that important? You see, oil and gas is larger than any single political party, any single grouping, any single special interest. Everyone, you have to have national buy-in, national consensus, and a collective understanding in the oil and gas sector. Now, our paper that we have, at least it's something to work with, and I must commend the government of Guyana for coming forward with a paper. The Chamber of Commerce has been on record since the beginning of 2017 calling for a paper. We are at the end of 2018 and we've received the paper. It's something good. I've heard persons saying that it's not a green paper, it's a white paper because it sets out certain clear policy guidelines and it's not discussion based and so on. But I do believe that if we are to put forward good cases as to why certain things must be adjusted or amended or give our input in certain regard, I think that the government will be receptive to this. But the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and it's a critical, I cannot emphasize this enough. It's a critical piece of macroeconomic tool in our macroeconomic toolbox for the management of this country. And Guyanese have to, they absolutely must pay attention to the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Why? It's not just the life of you which is at stake. This Sovereign Wealth Fund is something which is catering for your children and your children's children, because the nature of the Sovereign Wealth Fund is that that's why it has that saving component, because it's to ensure that the resources which we extract now, the benefits don't just accrue to this generation, but the benefits accrue to generations which are succeeding. That's why the Sovereign Wealth Fund is very, very important. It's a national issue and we must pay attention to it as keenly as we possibly can.
I think there is a disconnect. The individual on the street believes that the funds that are being developed through the oil and gas industry should be directly allocated to them, somewhere, somehow. The discussion about the future is not so prevalent.
Yes.
There was a recent discussion about everyone receiving $5,000 at the end of the year. Some said that was a good plan. Some said not so much. What do you feel? Do you think that the Sovereign Wealth Fund, as currently written, accommodates and tackles that situation?
The Sovereign Wealth Fund is just one tool in the macroeconomic toolbox. The other tool which we must talk about, and the Sovereign Wealth Fund makes reference to this, is a development plan. Because it's not just about getting this money. It's about what you're going to do with the money. And then how much money you get is one thing, what you do with the money is another thing. Because in public policy, you don't make reference only to quantity of spending or the amount of spending. You make reference also to the quality of spending. So it's not just about how much you spend, but what you spend on. And this is where a development plan is critical. How countries have approached it in the past is that they have laid out a 20-year plan or a 30-year plan. These 30-year plans have national buy-in from all segments of society, all sectors, government, civil society, opposition, private sector, academics, everyone. That 30-year plan or 20-year plan is then broken down into a 5-year plan. Now, 5-year plan, each year when the government presents a national budget, it feeds in to that 5-year plan, which is part of a larger 20-year plan. So you are not having this asynchronous one step forward, one step back type of ad hoc public budgeting. You're actually making a general push, or big push you call it in economic theory, a big push towards a specific objective. That specific objective is of course outlined in your development plan. In Guyana, we have in a conceptual form our Green State Development Strategy. Now I see the Sovereign Wealth Fund Green Paper making reference to the Green State Development Strategy, but this Green State Development Strategy has been in draft for quite some time now. I see that very recently we have entered into a new phase. We have moved out of the Green State Development Strategy framework document into a document which has more meat, as the 7 thematic groups of the Green State Development Strategy have been meeting to flesh out development objectives in their specific thematic areas. The Sovereign Wealth Fund must ensure that it feeds in to that development strategy, whether it's a Green State Development Strategy or whatever you want to call it. In our case, it's that, the GSDS. The reason why I think, going back to your original question, the reason why I think Guyanese people are not thinking about we must save this and put this aside for later and all of that, and that's why the Sovereign Wealth Fund of itself is not really an attractive topic as is local content in regards to oil and gas, is that we have such a deficit of demand in this country due to low income. We have such a deficit of infrastructure, not just physical infrastructure, but financial infrastructure, technological infrastructure, and other critical pieces in terms of the institutional and the legislative infrastructure. It is in such a deficit state that persons are thinking about, okay, if we have more resources, what can we spend on immediately? And this is where the Sovereign Wealth Fund also sets out how we approach it. The Sovereign Wealth Fund Green Paper, as we have it, does something which is called front loading of expenses, which means that a lot of money is going to be spent up front. And then as you proceed, so I'm going to just take an example, hypothetically, let's say you're going to spend 90% of your revenue earned and save 10%. That ratio is going to change, or it's going to be on a sliding scale as the years go along. So as the years go along, you're going to spend 90% of your revenue, then you're perhaps going to spend 80, 70, 60, and then you're going to begin to save more and more. The problem with that in our current context is that the Green State Development Strategy is not completed and it's not costed properly. If it's not completed, not costed properly, then we don't know what we're spending on. So from a development standpoint, sequencing of your public investment is also very important. What do I mean by sequencing of public investment? You can't say you're gonna, let's take education for example. You can't say you're gonna educate the population and you're gonna give them shoes, you're gonna give persons who are going to school shoes, you're gonna give them bicycles, or you're gonna give them book bags and so on, but you're not building a school. Sequencing of events, if you see where I'm coming from, sure. Is very important. You build the school, you build the road, then you begin to look at certain things, or you approach it in a simultaneous manner if your resources accommodate it. So sequencing of the public investment is also very important. Should we build a port and then build a bridge across the Demerara River? Should we build a highway extending from the airport down, or should we look at another road, or should we do both at the same time? So it's about how much you spend, what you're spending on, and also when you're spending, how you organize your spending. Now, if we track back to what you were saying, I think that because we are in such a deficit of all types of infrastructure, wages in Guyana are relatively low if we take it in an international comparative sense. those are the reasons why you have persons, and at the end of the day, rational human beings seek, their self-interest and what is there for them. So the current deficit, combined with the innate nature of man to actualize and pursue his self-interest, is part and parcel of why you see Guyanese persons focus on the now. Are they correct? I think yes, because all of us want to see a better life. All of us want to see things happening. All of us want to see Guyana becoming the Singapore of the West. And I think that we have it's an opportune time for us to actually put the framework in place to ensure that. And I'll tell you, I really do think, Andy, that we can.
I think from my perspective, I think there's a disconnect between the Green State Development Strategy and Guyana's maturity developmentally and economically.
Mm-hmm.
I think we are putting the cart before the horse. And that's just my personal opinion. I believe that these are things you do when the economy is flourishing, the economy is developed, and pay relative to another country isn't an issue.
Mm-hmm.
The transportation sector is intact.
Yeah.
And all the other parts of a community or a country that needs to be functioning properly. Maybe they can all work together, but I think it's placing a burden on the entire country as a whole, trying to develop both simultaneously,
Mm-hmm.
when one actually depends upon the other. They actually need to work in concert. Do you believe that this is the right time to look at the Green State Development Strategy as you're now? Because oil and green are at the total opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
They are on the total opposite of the spectrum, but I do think that we have an opportunity in Guyana here where we can make it work. We can perhaps be the first country that goes that route. We can take our oil revenues and ensure that the nature of our development is one which is along the line of green. But you're hitting at something which is innately deeper than just Guyana and just the GSDS. You see, the GSDS is modeled off of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you examine the Sustainable Development Goals and then you look at the critical perspectives which have been given on the Sustainable Development Goals, you found analysts saying that the Sustainable Development Goals seem to be very lofty and out of touch of the reality of developing countries and the developing countries' context, which is very different from what its predecessor was, the Millennium Development Goals, where you spoke about maternity rate and other things. Here, what we're doing with Sustainable Development Goals is that we are forcing developing countries to take responsibility for things in a general sense which they might not have been responsible for. For example, if you look at historically who has been polluting a lot more, it's those countries who are already industrialized, highly industrialized. Our carbon footprint here in Guyana and the other developing countries in the Anglophonic Caribbean are of the lowest in the world. Now, the critical question comes when it filters down, it's to what you are saying. Should we be pursuing that type of development strictly hinged on the Sustainable Development Goals? At this juncture, I think that the international architecture places us in a position that we have to. The President of Guyana has signed on to the Paris Convention, and we have made certain commitments as regards renewable energy, and our reduction of carbon emissions and that sort of thing by a certain time period. If you look at when other countries were developing their oil and gas sector, this factor was not in place. So it is oftentimes that the policy of a country and the nature, the trajectory of development of the country follows the line of the international architecture at the point in time. This is why if you look at in the 1970s and the 1980s, when you have many countries following the import substitution industrialization model and fixed exchange rates and blocking imports and that sort of thing, that was the modus operandi of the development of countries in that period. Now, since liberalization and Washington consensus and us moving away from that ISI model of development, we have now moved out of that and into what is called development with a human face, looking at Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. But personally, I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are lofty. They are and should be used prescriptively rather than as a guiding, rather than as a strict construct which we must hinge on. So prescriptively or as a guiding light. All right. So it should be where we want to go. It should be the end and not the means to the end. And this is where we as a country, we have to take stock and say, okay, which of these goals can we realistically achieve contingent on the fact that we still have our industrial development to think about. We still have persons who don't have potable water. We still have basic infrastructure which is lacking. We still have financial illiteracy in many areas. We still have a deficit in terms of our technological development. How much innovation are we doing? Are we protecting intellectual property to promote private sector development and key innovations in the economy? So I understand what you're saying. It's that we have been forced by a number of differing dimensions that exist, some within the country and some externally, to move along this line. I do think, though, that at this current juncture, we are uniquely poised to perhaps become one of the first countries in the world to take an extractive industry such as oil and gas and put it towards green development and sustainable development.
There's an old Greek saying that says, "A society grows great when old men plant trees under which branches they know they shall never sit."
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the approach that this government needs to take, and I'm not seeing it. I think from where I sit, again, this is my personal belief, there needs to be a countrywide integrated development architecture,
Yes.
cross-spanning all the ministries.
Yes.
I am not seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
But as you're saying now, there's the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and there are these other agreements in place to answer some of those issues.
Mm-hmm.
How successful have you been trying to articulate this to the government?
Mm-hmm. I'll answer that, and then I just want to go off on a tangent on something which is interrelated. The government is receptive to meeting. Personally, the private sector, from my vantage point, the private sector plays an integral role in the crafting of the Green State Development Strategy. The government of Guyana meets with us on a consistent basis to listen to our views regarding things such as local content. We have not gone the route as yet of meeting on the Sovereign Wealth Fund and other issues related to oil and gas. But I do think that a national cooperative approach in terms of a multi-sectoral approach, public sector, private sector, civil society, academia, it's definitely needed here in Guyana. Have we been as successful as we want to be? No. That's a straight answer. But are we moving in a general direction that we think is something that is encouraging? I think we are moving in that direction. But I want to highlight something, though, Andy, which I don't want to miss on this program as we're in this topic of discussion. Institutions play a very important role. A very, very important role. You know, there's a saying in development literature that a country's development is only as strong as its institutions. Here in Guyana, I am not certain that our institutions are yet ready for oil and gas. And when I say institutions, I'm not just talking about a specific organization, but I'm talking about a multidimensional type of analysis of institutions. So I'm talking here about organizations, ethos and culture of doing business, the use of information and information technology, or general what we call modus vivendi, the way of living or mode of living. So our institutions, in an overarching sense, they certainly need work. Because I'll give one example. If you have companies here, or you have businesses here who are not accustomed, or they are not attuned to taking records, the oil and gas sector depends on records. That is something which we have to have a cultural transformation in the modus operandi of doing business, or the ethos of business has to transform. It is something which I think has to come from internally. An internal dynamic has to play a push factor, and the external dynamic of the oil and gas sector will pull. So it's going to have to come two ways. The pulling has already started for those private sector companies who want to be innovative, who want to become part of it. The pushing, however, has to come from deliberate government policy. It also has to come from support from organizations such as the Chamber of Commerce and the Private Sector Commission and other sectoral, other private sector umbrella organizations. And as such, that will ensure that we have this cultural transformation. But don't get me wrong, there are other things that we have to correct in this country. Our legislation, our legal framework accommodate everything that we want to do regarding oil and gas? Does the government, when they receive the money, and I'm not talking here about a political party in government, but I'm talking here about the institution of government, does the institution of government have the capacity to spend? I think a lot of persons ignore that, because if we have a public sector investment program, a PSIP, our capital expenditure program of the government, we're at half year in 2017, it was 28%. All right, this year we have some improvements, the numbers have gone up, but it is indicative of our inability to spend. If you have leakages from your system due to corruption and so on, what do you think is going to happen? I use this analogy quite often when I meet with the World Bank and the IMF and so on, when they want to come and survey the landscape and see what's happening. I say, always take a look at our institutions and use this analogy. Institutions in Guyana or institutions in a country are like a bucket, all right? And the bucket which has holes is a country which has weak institutions. What happens when you have one source of income? You have the water from the tap going into the bucket, and there are leakages out of the bucket. If you have 3-4 taps, oil and gas, mining, taxation revenue, when you add oil and gas revenue, which is a massive tap, what's going to happen? You're going to have the same rate of leakage. You're going to have leakages, but on a massive scale. So there are certain institutional things that we have to correct here in our country, and I think that a comprehensive analysis, an empirically driven analysis needs to be taken. That is definitely something that we need to move towards here in Guyana. Dr. Dragon used to say something, if GAF could have built a country, Guyana would have been the best in the world. Here in Guyana, we need to move towards empirical forms of analysis, and we need to begin to move away from analogy and just simply thinking that we're going to GAF our way in and out of this. How many persons have actually explored using data or making data-driven decisions. How many persons keep sufficient records to say that they are going to observe over a time period what have been the dynamic changes associated with their business? Or how much of government records are available. I mean, you take a look at some of our statistics. Some of our statistics are outdated. You take a look at some of our institutions, or some of our institutions don't have modern management systems. You take a look at some of our laws. We still have laws on the books from 1905. All of these things need updating, a comprehensive review to ensure that if and when the oil and gas money begins to come on stream, we are ready and well prepared as a country for this.
How successful have you been partnering local companies with companies in the oil and gas industry?
Very successful, very successful. The Georgetown Chamber of Commerce has been on a mission to externalize our Chamber of Commerce, and in this regard, as has been popularized in the news, we have signed a number of MOUs, and those MOUs have been activated through trade facilitation councils, as well as inviting and fielding trade missions. The numbers are in they're still in below 100, but we're getting there. We have a number of companies in and out of the chamber here in the private sector who are partnering and who are actually winning contracts.
That's excellent. But you being at the helm, Guyana's future in terms of GCCI is great. What do you project for GCCI in the coming years?
I see the Chamber of Commerce as becoming a more important stakeholder in the national discourse. Why? Because the private sector for a long time in Guyana has been a sector which traditionally has not been as strong as it should be. I think, however, that with oil and gas and with new developments, with the adoption of ICT and so on, the private sector is moving at a much faster rate in terms of its rate of growth and its pace of development. I think that we are beginning to understand that things in a more dynamic international sense, and the Chamber of Commerce being the hub for the private sector here in Guyana, one of the hubs, but certainly a key stakeholder in terms of private sector development, will continue to support private sector development, will continue to facilitate trade, and I think that we've actually entered into a new dimension here in private sector development. So we are looking at improved trade, we're looking at increased investment, both local capital formation and foreign capital foreign or inward investment flows. We're also looking at how we can improve and implement standards, quality and standards. We are also looking at ways that we can support the development of entities, not just advocating for a macroeconomic position, but also examining firms in Guyana to see how they can improve in their productivity. So the Chamber of Commerce, I think, has a major role to play in the future of Guyana's development, and certainly with the private sector leapfrogging in its size and its stake which it has in the economy, the Chamber of Commerce will only grow stronger.
Well, thank you, Rich. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join me here this evening.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm extending this an open invitation to you and the Chamber to visit us here at any time that you can, as our scheduling permits. But further, to partner with a Changing Guyana to utilize this forum as a means of keeping all of Guyana informed and the changes taking place within the country. To our listening audience, I thank you for tuning in to our 5th show. Please join me, your host, Andrew Austin, again next week at 8 p.m. here on Save TV Channel 2 for A Changing Guyana, where the change you seek begins with you. Our special guest next week will be the Director General of Guyana's Civil Aviation Administration, Mr. Egbert Field. This will be an exciting show where we will be discussing some of the many transformative changes he has implemented and has in store for Guyana's Civil Aviation Administration. Looking forward to seeing you then. Have a good night.